Hello and welcome to Lecture 4 on Psychological Disorders. So in this lecture we're going to look at the diathesis stress model. We're going to look at some of the biological, environmental, and cognitive behavioral causes of psychological disorders. And we're going to discuss sex differences and cultural differences in psychological disorders. So we do know that there's a lot of evidence to show that both biological and environmental factors play an important role in the development of psychopathologies. And there's what's called the diathesis stress model. And this is a diagnostic model that proposes that a disorder may develop when an underlying vulnerability is coupled with a precipitating event. And I've touched on this in previous lectures. I've talked about how genetic predispositions need some stressor to be triggered in order to be expressed. So, you can have family members that may share the same genetic predisposition for, let's say, colon cancer. But your genetics is not your destiny. Genetic predispositions must be triggered for that genetic predisposition to be expressed. And it needs a precipitating event. So for colon cancer, that can be something as simple as an unhealthy diet for extensive period of time. Because, colon health has a lot to do with diet. So an underlying vulnerability, I think, is really well defined as a genetic predisposition. It's not the only type of vulnerability there is, but I think it's the best example for this purpose. And a precipitating event is going to be some kind of stressor. That can be physiological, psychological. Something does not have to be emotionally stressful to stress your body, to stress your nervous system. So, diathesis is right here. You've got your genetic predisposition, and let's say, so we know that, people with genetic predispositions for things like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, if they experience childhood trauma, they are more vulnerable to that genetic predisposition being triggered. That makes them more vulnerable to actually developing that disorder. So you've got let's use bipolar disorder, the genetic predisposition for bipolar disorder, the stress of childhood trauma. You have that heightened vulnerability to bipolar disorder. High stress, childhood trauma leads to a higher probability of bipolar disorder. And minimal stressful circumstances are going to be a lower probability of developing bipolar disorder. And there is some evidence to show that. Childhood trauma, but also just highly stressful childhoods. Living in poverty is very stressful on children. That can be stressful enough that if they have a genetic predisposition, years of that stress can add up and be enough to trigger that genetic predisposition. I am not saying that being poor makes you more likely to develop mental illness. I am not saying that. I'm simply saying that there are all kinds of stressors. It doesn't have to be a traumatic event. Long-term chronic stress itself is a stressor to the body. Your body doesn't understand the difference between good stress and bad stress. So, like, weddings are incredibly stressful, and often brides and grooms, or grooms and brides are wondering, God, I'm supposed to be so happy right now. Why am I not happy right now? It's because the situation is just too stressful. It is a situation that they want and they're happy about in general, but the situation itself is taxing their nervous system too much. And their nervous system can't tell that it's supposed to be a happy stress and not unpleasant stress. So the biological perspective focuses on how physiological factors contribute to psychological disorders. And this is most of this comes to genetics. So genetic factors can affect the production and levels of neurotransmitters in the brain, can affect the receptor sites in the brain, how well receptor sites function with their dedicated neurotransmitters. Genetics can also affect the size of brain structures and how well different areas of the brain connect to each other. The body it's amazing and it's complex. And genetic disorders are extraordinarily complex. So some disorders may arise from prenatal problems, such as prenatal malnutrition, exposure to toxins, maternal illnesses. An example is, those who had a mother who had influenza during their second term of pregnancy have a higher chance of being diagnosed with schizophrenia than those who had mothers that did not have influenza during the second term of pregnancy. Influenza, it's a virus, works as a toxin to the fetus. And now, schizophrenia has a strong genetic predisposition. So I think we can safely say almost all of these fetuses are going to have the genetic predisposition. Influenza would be the stressor. Could be the stressor that makes that fetus more vulnerable to developing the actual disorder later on. During childhood and adolescence, environmental toxins and malnutrition can put an individual at risk for mental disorders. I've been doing a lot of reading on poverty and mental illness. And the role of poverty is so powerful. You wouldn't think that malnutrition is a big problem in the United States, but amongst poor children, it's a very big problem. And we also we're seeing more and more childhood diabetes. One of the reasons for that is when you're growing up in poverty, you're usually being raised on SNAP benefits. It's a lot cheaper to feed your children pastas and simple carbohydrates because they are very filling. And it's a way to make the food money stretch. But kids, when you're on SNAP benefits, it's really hard to feed your kids lots of healthy fruits and vegetables and juices and, the healthy whole grains. It's hard to afford those things. And so, but also there's the stress of not having clean clothes and going to school in dirty clothes. And large number of children now are actually unhoused. The stress of not knowing where food is going to come from, of food insecurity, of housing insecurity, has a huge impact on child mental health and definitely can be a potential trigger for a genetic predisposition for disorders in the future, if they have that genetic predisposition. So biological factors may contribute to mental disorders because of their effects on the central nervous system. Stress attacks the nervous system, and usually our bodies can handle it. Our body is made to handle a certain amount of stress, but it does reach its limits. And for those who have genetic vulnerabilities, their nervous system is going to be a little more sensitive. Functional neuroimaging is currently at the forefront of research into the neurological components of mental disorders. There's some really fascinating research being done with neuroimaging, really on just about anything you can think of that has to do with human cognition, human emotion. And we're getting to the point now that the neuroimaging techniques, PET scans, fMRI scans, are now showing individual differences in neurological functioning. You know, we've gone from being able to just find tumors or abnormalities in a person's brain to actually finding functional differences in individual brains. There's also some new neuroimaging that's able to look at individual strands of neurons that have wired together. This is really new. Those strands are called connectomes. They're basically neural pathways. And in the future, our ability to identify connectomes is going to have a huge impact on the treatment of neurological problems, neurological disorders, and traumatic brain injury. So here's an example of genetic predispositions and stressors. And these are two identical twins. One has schizophrenia and one does not. The one with schizophrenia is this gentleman on the right. And I know that not because, yes, I've read the textbook a bunch of times, but I don't remember them telling me which one it is. I know that those with schizophrenia have larger ventricles in the brain. Ventricles are areas that fill with cerebral spinal fluid. And so you can see this twin shows more black area here than his twin. These are identical twins. You can see that there's more cerebral spinal fluid in the center of the brain here. There is less tissue for the twin that has schizophrenia. And you can see tissue loss really throughout the brain. Anywhere you see black, if you compare it to his twin, you will see that in many places there's much more cerebral spinal fluid than the twin has that does not have schizophrenia. And I think this is fascinating, the power of genetic predispositions. So I'd like you to go watch the video titled Mental Disorders as Brain Disorders, and you'll find that on Moodle in the folder titled Chapter 14, Psychological Disorders, Lecture Videos. Welcome back. I really like that video, and I very much agree with the speaker that I think it's time to really simply categorize mental illnesses as neurological disorders. There's just so much evidence that the brain changes when people are suffering from a mental illness. And that change isn't necessarily permanent. You know, someone can have a depressive episode. You'll see neurological changes, but then they come out of it and their brain is back to normal. So we'll pick up there in our next lecture. Thanks so much.